Welcome to the Latino and American Studies Spring Semester event series. This semester on popular religion in Latin America. Tonight is our second event. We'll have another one in March and another one in April. And so look for our email announcements. So tonight we have Alex Gold will introduce our speaker. So welcome, Alex, and thanks for coming.
Okay. Hey guys, thanks for coming. My name is Alex Wald, and I am one of Brian's former students, and I have the great honor of introducing him tonight. So Brian is himself a former Johnny student. He received his Bachelor of Arts in History from St. John's in 1992, and then went on to study Latin American history at the University of Austin, Texas, where he received a Master of Arts in 1994 and a PhD in 1999. Brian previously taught World and Latin American history at the University of Maine at Presque Isle. In the year 2000, Brian returned home to St. John's, where he's now a fully tenured professor in the history department, which I believe means you can now say whatever you want without any reparations. So, he currently teaches introductory courses on colonial and modern Latin American history and upper division courses on Mexico and religion in Latin America. He currently is doing some pretty cool research on religion in colonial Mexico, and if you really enjoy the talk tonight, you should check out his book, which is titled The Very Nature of God, Baroque Catholicism and Religious Reform in Bourbon, Mexico City. It's a little plug. You can find it on Amazon. I think they just put it on sale, actually. I sometimes try it.
You can actually get it an ebook for free through Project Muse. So you don't have to pay for it.
But if you feel like contributing to the author, feel free to have it.
I'll get that 50 cents from it.
Right. And then his daughter, Carolina, wanted me to also announce that he's a great father, which is another qualification. So without further ado, Dr. Brian Larkin.
Well, thank you, Eleonora, and thank you, Alex, for the introduction. As Eleonora Bertrano, the Director of Latino Latin American Studies, said, every semester the Latino Latin American Studies program hosts a series of talks around a particular theme. And this semester the theme is popular religion in Latin America. And I thought, well, what's the most popular religious theme in Latin America? And of course it's the Virgin of Guadalupe. If you're not familiar with the popularity of the Virgin of Guadalupe, this is an aerial view of the plaza at Tepeyac, the hill where the apparition occurred, or just below the hill where the apparition occurred. And what you see here is the church that was constructed beginning in 1695 and completed in 1707. And here you have the modern, what I call Starship Enterprise version of the Basilica of Guadalupe. And in front of it you can see just the masses of people that come to the Virgin, to Tepeyac every day. And this is not even a big crowd at Tepeyac. I'm looking on the crowd, and I know that a lot of people must have the basic story of the Virgin of Guadalupe down, the apparition story. Anybody want to share what you know about the Virgin of Guadalupe? Someone's got to know. Anybody know the basic story of the apparition? Okay, Alyssa, thank
you. Okay, so Virgin of Guadalupe, I don't remember the guy's name.
Juan Diego.
Juan Diego was I'm a really great storyteller. Juan Diego was like hiking up a mountain or something, and he came across this lady who then puts her, ends up with putting her face on his turban.
Okay, so
thing, and then her face is now still on it in something in that place.
Okay, so it occurs at this site.
Yeah.
Anybody know more or less when the apparition occurred according to tradition?
Right after the Spanish conquest.
Yeah, soon after the Spanish conquest. The Spaniards and their indigenous allies, and it's mostly their indigenous allies, defeat the capital city of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, in 1521. And according to tradition, in 1531, one of the Indians from around the area was walking by and was attracted to the hill and saw an apparition of the Virgin. And there were actually a series of 3 or 4 apparitions, depending on which story you're looking at. But she asked him to go to the Bishop of Mexico, Juan de Zumárraga, and have proclaim that there's an apparition here at Tepeyac and to have a shrine built. And Juan Diego goes to the bishop, but's not allowed to see him on the first apparition. Second apparition, Juan Diego tries to beg off from going back to the bishop, says, you know, I'm not a good speaker, no one's going to listen to me. Oh, and by the way, my uncle is sick. My uncle Juan Bernardino is sick, and so I can't go. Finally, third apparition, the Virgin says to him, collect the flowers from around here that are in bloom out of season. Take them to the bishop as a sign, as a wonder, so that he will believe you. And so he takes off his cloak, his ayate or his tuma, sometimes it's called, wraps the flowers in them, takes them to the bishop Juan de Zumárraga, unrolls it, and as he unrolls it, lo and behold, there's an image of the Virgin on his tuma, or his ayate. So it happened, according to tradition, in 1531, 10 years after the conquest of Tenochtitlan, or the fall of Tenochtitlan. And the thing that's really important about this is that the Virgin appears to an indigenous person, and also that the image on the cloak, on the ayate, is divinely painted. It's not painted by a human being, but it appears miraculously. The Virgin of Guadalupe is by far the most popular religious devotion in Latin America today. She has a lot of meanings connected to her. Anybody know any of the special meanings that are connected to the Virgin of Guadalupe? You must have heard about her. Okay.
One of them has to do with something she's wearing indicates she's pregnant. Is that?
Okay. They talk about that she is pregnant. That the belt that she's wearing signifies that. So that's one of the things. But what special meanings are associated with the Virgin of Guadalupe? Anybody know?
That she's dark-skinned.
That she's dark-skinned. Mm-hmm. That she appears indigenous, and she appeared to an indigenous person. And so in Mexico, many people will refer to her as La Morena or La Morenita, the brown one, or the little brown one. And that she has, she especially chosen the indigenous population to appear to the indigenous population and to be an aid to the indigenous population. She's also very much tied to Mexican nationalism. One author, one theologian, Janet Rodriguez, has written in one of her books that to be Mexican or Mexican American is to have reference to the Virgin of Guadalupe. So she's a symbol of Mexican nationalism. Here is a quote by Virgil Elizondo, who is, I would say, probably the father of Latino theology. And this is what he says one of the significances of the Virgin of Guadalupe is. In her, the people experience acceptance, dignity, love, and protection. They dare to affirm life even when all others deny them life. Were it not for Our Lady of Guadalupe, there would be no Mexican or Mexican-American people today. The great Mexican nations had been defeated by the Spanish invasion, which came to a violent and bloody climax in 1521. The native peoples who had not been killed no longer wanted to live. Everything of value to them, including their gods, had been destroyed. Nothing was worth living for. But Guadalupe provides solace, consolation to this defeated and dispossessed population. So she has a special connection with the indigenous population to the defeated. She's a mother figure. She provides solace and comfort. I wanted to give you this picture because this is the image of Guadalupe in the modern basilica. This is, as you're on the conveyor belt, you can't actually stand and watch and look up. You have to be on a conveyor belt that takes you across, otherwise there would be too many people gathered around. But the Mexican flag is prominently displayed with the word Virgin of Guadalupe. She is a symbol of the Mexican nation. Okay. These are some of the modern significances of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Tonight, though, I'd like to suggest something a little bit different. I don't mean to suggest that these significances that exist in the present day are somehow wrong, but the historical record suggests something very different about the Virgin of Guadalupe in her past. The tendency is in the present to assume that what we think in the present pertains to the past as well, and we have a tendency to telescope that or telegraph that back to the past. So tonight I want to make essentially 3 points. One is that historical accounts suggest a more mundane origin and a limited local appeal of the Virgin of Guadalupe before 1648. Second, that Guadalupean devotion grew after 1648 largely because of Creole patriotism. Creole patriotism, I'll explain in a bit. What you need to know right now that Creoles are full-blooded Spaniards. They're Spanish. They were born in the New World, but they're full-blooded Spanish. And the rise in popularity of Guadalupe has to do with this Spanish population. And the last thing, if we have time to do this, is that despite the growth in popularities in the Virgin of Guadalupe, which really takes off after 1737, she still remains one of only many miraculous images that the people of Mexico have resort to in the colonial period. So those are my 3 basic points. Okay. You'll notice that the year 1648 is prominent in the first 2 of my points, and that's because 1648 is the first time that we ever hear of the apparition story. It was written in this book, La Imagen de la Virgen María, Madre de Dios de Guadalupe, by Miguel Sanchez. Miguel Sanchez was a Creole priest from Mexico City. He wrote an erudite treatise. It's long. It tells the basic apparition story, but most of the book is dedicated to theological arguments trying to link the Virgin of Guadalupe to the Lady of the Apocalypse. It's tangential, it's baroque, it's meandering, it's a difficult read. It was intended for a scholarly, priestly audience, but it's what began, as best we can tell, the popularity of the apparition story. There are a couple of points to make about this book as well. First of all, Miguel Sanchez claims in his book that the story of the apparition had been almost forgotten, that hardly anybody knew about it in Mexico City, that he didn't consult documents about it, but that he consulted elderly people who lived in and around Mexico City and learned the story from them. The censors who actually approved the book, and at this time, it was the period of the Spanish Inquisition, and so all books had to be approved. And so censors had to read the book first and give their approval before a book could be published, and they always published their approbation at the beginnings of the book. There were 2 censors for this book. One was Francisco de Siles, and the other was Luis Lasso de la Vega. Luis Lasso de la Vega will become important a little bit later on. Both of these censors, in their approbations, agreed that no one had heard of this story before. And they were astounded. And they thanked Miguel Sanchez for publishing the story and making it known. Okay. This sudden appearance of the apparition story is quite striking. And in fact, what strikes most historians who study the Virgin of Guadalupe or who study piety, colonial piety in Mexico, is actually the profound silence about the Virgin of Guadalupe before 1648. Okay. If she had been popular, if there had been apparition stories circulating about her, we most likely would have heard about them before 1648. I don't want to belabor this point because we could go through a whole list of chronicles that were written in the colonial period. But I want to point out 3 profound silences about the Virgin of Guadalupe. One is simply the documentation from Bishop Juan de Zumárraga himself. Juan de Zumárraga was the first bishop of Mexico. Many of his papers survive. We have his Libros de Gobernación, his sort of entry books. We have other documents from him. The Virgin of Guadalupe does not appear at all in any of his writings. There's another important work that was written by a guy named Juan de Torquemada, and it's called the Monarquía Indiana, or the Monarchy of the Indies. Torquemada was a Franciscan friar, and he published his book in 1615. And it's a massive 3-volume history of Mexico. It looks at pre-Columbian history, it looks at the Aztecs, it looks at the conquest, and it looks at the important political and religious events in Mexico up to 1615. There's not a single mention of the Virgin of Guadalupe in his book. There's another important chronicle, this one written by Juan de Grijalva, and he was an Augustinian friar. And he published a history of the Augustinians in Mexico in 1624. And this looks at the history of the Augustinians and their work in evangelizing the indigenous populations, among other things. Not a single mention of the Virgin of Guadalupe. However, he does mention a whole lot of other important miraculous images in Mexico at the time. And he spends a lot of time particularly on Our Lady of Remedies. Our Lady of Remedies in this time period, the early 17th century, was by far the most popular, the most resorted to miraculous image around Mexico City. Our Lady of Remedies, the story or the tradition goes that it was an image brought from Spain with Hernan Cortez and his band of Spanish adventurers who participated in the conquest of Tenochtitlan. They were housed, they were welcomed in Tenochtitlan at first for a while until they angered their Aztec hosts, who then attacked them, and the Spaniards had to flee. And what has become known as the Noche Triste, or the Sad Night. And the Aztecs killed probably about 4/5 or more of the Spanish band then. But according to the story, the Spaniards were able to take the image of Remedies with them, but they didn't take it to their final refuge. They buried it because they had to, they had to move. And 20 years later, an Indian named Juan Bernardino found it. And then the image was miraculous. It was housed in a church in a pueblo called Naucalpan, which is just west of, or was just west of Mexico City. Now it's part of the urban sprawl of Mexico City. But the Virgin of Remedies is mentioned a lot, not only by Juan de Grijalva in his chronicle, but by lots of others as well. This lack of mention of the apparition story of the Virgin of Guadalupe before 1648 has led some to conclude that Miguel Sanchez entirely invented the story in 1648. The most prominent advocate of this theory is a guy named Stafford Poole. That's him here. I can only find one picture of him online. But this is his book, Our Lady of Guadalupe. Notice the CM after his name. It stands for Congregation in the Mission, which means that he is a Vicencian priest. He's a Catholic priest. He's also a very prominent historian of colonial Mexico. He's written a number of books on colonial Mexico, beyond this one as well. He's actually most famous, among people like me for other things. But he's famous or infamous within some Catholic circles for this book. and also for a letter that he co-authored in 1996 that was sent to the papacy. In 1996, the papacy was in the process of deciding whether or not to canonize Juan Diego. This is a portrait, or not a portrait, but an image of Juan Diego painted by Miguel Cabrera, who's a very famous painter in Mexico City in the 18th century. The papacy was considering whether or not to canonize Juan Diego, and Stafford Poole wrote, or co-wrote, a letter to the Vatican saying, you cannot canonize Juan Diego because he most likely never existed. So they can't canonize him. One of the co-authors was another man named Guillermo Schulenberg. He was also a Catholic priest, and he was the abbot of the Basilica of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And they said, you cannot canonize him because he probably never existed. Their letter was ignored, and Juan Diego was canonized in the summer of 2002. Now, I don't want to suggest that the Virgin of Guadalupe was not mentioned at all before 1648, because that's simply not true. The apparition story was never mentioned before 1648. And it's clear that the Virgin of Guadalupe received some devotion. But she was only one of many important religious images, the Virgin of Remedies being the most important. Probably the second most important in the city of Mexico at this time was the Cristo de Ixmiquilpan, a long story that I won't go into, but he was housed in a convent in Mexico City, a Carmelite convent in Mexico City at the time. That these two images were more significant than the Virgin of Guadalupe, and she was just sort of a run-of-the-mill miraculous image. And also, like all of these miraculous images, they did draw devotion, but it was mostly from a local area, from Mexico City itself or from its environs. So not from further afield. So, what do we know about the Virgin of Guadalupe before 1648? We do know actually a fair bit. We know that a shrine existed at Tepeyac by 1555 or 1556. We know that the image that we see today was in that shrine by 1555 or 1556. And we know this because of at least three key pieces of evidence. One is from an indigenous chronicler. His name was Chimal Payin, and he wrote a chronicle of his home pueblo, or his hometown of Chalco, which is just south of Mexico City, or it was just south of Mexico City. Again, it's part of the urban sprawl of Mexico City now. And he said in 1615 that, quote, that the Virgin of Guadalupe, quote, revealed herself, unquote, in 1556. He wrote this in Nahuatl, which was the indigenous language of the Aztecs. And so this shows us a couple of things. First of all, that the Virgin of Guadalupe did have some indigenous devotees at this time, and she was drawing devotees from as far away as just south of Mexico City. Scholars have argued a lot about the Nahuatl translation, revealed herself, because it could mean she appeared as in an apparition, or it could mean that she was made known. I'm not a specialist in Nahuatl, so I'm not going to get into that, but I just wanted to let you know that there's some controversy about that one. But that's actually the least important of the evidence that we have. There's another very important piece of evidence that gives us some information about the Virgin of Guadalupe before 1648, and that's a report that was written by the Viceroy, or the Vice King of Mexico, so the king's right-hand man in Mexico, and his name was Martin Enriquez de Almanza. And he had a report written about the Virgin of Guadalupe and her shrine in 1575, because he was a devotee of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And this report has 3 important points. One, it claims that the shrine was built either in 1555 or 1556, not in 1531. Also, that the shrine became popular because of a miraculous cure of a shepherd, not because of an apparition. And thirdly, it makes absolutely no mention of an apparition story. But probably the most important piece of evidence that we have comes from a dispute that occurred in Mexico in 1556. It has to do with this man, the Archbishop of Mexico, Alonso de Montúfar. He was the second Archbishop of Mexico, followed Juan de Zumárraga. We know that on September 6 of 1556, he preached a sermon in which he glorified the Virgin of Guadalupe. He was a devotee of the Virgin of Guadalupe. We know that 2 days later, the provincial of the Franciscans in Mexico, and his name was Francisco de Bustamante, preached another sermon in which he criticized the Archbishop, and that this caused a remarkable scandal within Mexico. People were talking about it. And so the Archbishop ordered an investigation of Bustamante's sermon. We don't have Montúfar's sermon and we don't have Bustamante's sermon, but we have a report about them. And so we actually know quite a bit about what the content of Bustamante's sermon was because of what witnesses said. And so we know that Bustamante said that he criticized devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe. He said that the devotion and the shrine were new, that it wasn't known before 1556. We know that the Archbishop Montúfar supported Guadalupe and promoted miracles associated with the Virgin of Guadalupe. We know that the Franciscans strongly opposed devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe. We also know that most of the people who went to the shrine to pray and to receive or to ask for miraculous cures or to have reference to the Virgin of Guadalupe were Spaniards rather than Indians. And we also know that Bustamante claimed that the image was painted by a human being. And one of the witnesses that was interviewed said that Bustamante in his sermon had claimed that an indigenous artist known as Marcos de Aquino was the artist who painted the image. Now, again, we do know that there was an image, there was a shrine there by 1555 or 1556, and it did receive some devotion. Some of that devotion was indigenous. We also know that a lot of that devotion was Spanish, and we have more evidence of that as well. And one of the clearest pieces of evidence that we have for that is this print. One of the later archbishops of Mexico, Juan de Pérez de la Serna, was a devotee of Guadalupe and promoted devotion to her and wanted to build a new shrine at Tepeyac. And so when he became bishop, he sold indulgences to raise money to build the shrine. And so on pieces of paper were printed the indulgence, this, and you could purchase one, and you would contribute to the building of a new shrine. This is actually a very interesting print, and it tells us a lot. It tells us, the Archbishop supports it. We know that it has Spanish support. It also has images of 8 miracles associated with the Virgin of Guadalupe. Only one of them refers to an indigenous person. The rest are Spanish, people who received the miracles. And what's really interesting is that of all these 8 miracles, none of them refer to the apparition, the most miraculous event of all. But De la Serna was successful, raised money, and in 1622 built a new shrine. We also know that the Virgin of Guadalupe must have been popular within Mexico City because she was brought from her shrine at Tepeyac in 1629 to the Cathedral of Mexico City. Mexico City was built on a swampy island in the middle of 5 lakes, and it flooded a lot. And in 1629, a really bad flood occurred. It lasted for 5 years, until 1634. People thought that the Virgin of Guadalupe was particularly helpful in cases of flood, so they brought her image from Tepeyac to the cathedral, and there she resided for 5 years. So we do know that she did have devotion. From Chimalpain, we know that she had some indigenous devotion as well. But that devotion comes from local areas, and the Virgin of Guadalupe is certainly not the most popular of the images, miraculous images in Mexico City at the time. We'll move on to my second point. And this is that Guadalupean devotion grew after 1648 largely because of Creole patriotism. Remember I said that Creoles were full-blooded Spaniards, but born in the New World. And so we have to know what Creole patriotism is. And in order to know what Creole patriotism is, we have to know what Peninsulars are. And Peninsulars were full-blooded Spaniards, but born back on the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, back in Spain. And over the colonial period, there was rivalry between Peninsulars and Creoles. And a lot of ink was spilled about this rivalry. In fact, Peninsulars tended to denigrate the Creoles. They called them slow-witted, torpid, phlegmatic, weak-willed, and disparaged them greatly. And they based this on the science of the day, which was astrology. You may think that this sounds weird because you think astrology is about predicting the future, looking at stars. Well, that's one aspect of it. But in traditional astrology, it was the science, or pre-science, of understanding how heavenly bodies affected the environment, and how in turn the environment affected the creatures that lived within that environment. And so back in Spain, the Peninsulars wrote that we have wonderful human bodies that govern our environment here in Europe, which gives us a temperate and dry climate. And this temperate and dry climate produces human bodies that are vigorous, that are intelligent, that are strong-willed. But over in the Americas, they have bad heavenly bodies that govern their environment. And it makes the environment hot and humid. And we all know that hot and humid environments produce slow, dull-witted, and the terms that they used most were torpid and phlegmatic bodies. And so they denigrated the Creoles because they'd grown up. They were born in this environment and grown up in it. But most importantly, the Peninsulars used this rhetoric as a political tool. Peninsulars wanted to control government posts in the bureaucracy and in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. And this rhetoric of this astrological rhetoric allowed them to exclude Creoles from these positions, or at least to argue for their exclusion. Well, Creoles responded to this by the 17th century, and they developed their own patriotic astrology, which essentially said, no, the heavenly bodies here are fantastic. They're better than ones back in Spain, and we're much smarter than you guys are. That was one of their lines of response. But another line of response was to look for prodigious occurrences in the Americas, and to claim that the Americas were better than Europe. And just as Creoles were developing this Creole patriotism, that's exactly when we get the story of the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Why is this important? Because the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, according to the apparition story, was painted by the divine hand. No other image in Europe could claim that privilege. Some were claimed to have been painted by St. Luke, but St. Luke isn't the Virgin Mary, or St. Luke isn't God. So that Mexicans could claim that they had received such an honor was a way of snubbing their noses at peninsulars. And we see this from the very beginning. In Miguel Sanchez's work, it's replete with this stuff, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. He claims that the Virgin of Guadalupe is our sovereign American lady. And he claims that Creoles have an intimate and special brotherhood of relationship with Mary. This is why you don't want to read it, because you have to try to read sentences like this. In this her image, since she is reborn miraculously in the land where they are born. So he's creating an identity and association between Creoles on the one hand and the Virgin of Guadalupe on the other. I'm going to return to this theme of Creole patriotism a little bit later. But I just want to mention a few other things about the Virgin of Guadalupe and the growth in her popularity after 1648. One of the clearest ways that we can see that just growing in popularity is just because after 1648 there's a profusion of books about her. There's a profusion of sermons about her, particularly in the 1670s and later on. So we know that she's becoming more popular. I want to talk just about two of these books. One is a book written by Luis, or claimed to have been written by Luis Lasso de la Vega. Remember, he was one of the censors who approved Miguel Sanchez's book, in which he claimed he had never heard of this story before. In 1649, he publishes this work, Iwe Clama Witz Zoltica, which is a collection of stories about the Virgin of Guadalupe, miracle stories, the apparition story, etc. The most important part of this, however, is the Nicamopowa, which is the apparition story. It's written in Nahuatl, the indigenous language of the Aztecs. And today, this is considered the standard version of the apparition story. Some have even claimed that it's based on oral tradition that goes back to the apparition itself. I just want to make a couple of points about this book. First of all, it's impossible to date. It's impossible to date, but its basic outline follows Miguel Sanchez's story. And Miguel Sanchez's story and the one in the Nicamopowa follow a traditional European apparition storyline. If you read apparition stories from Europe from the late medieval period and early modern period, they follow the exact same storyline. You just change characters. The one thing that's new in this one is that the divine hand painted the image. Second, the Nicamopowa and other parts of the book contain a lot of grammatical errors in Nahuatl that suggest that it was not written by a native speaker. But probably the most important thing is that the Nicamopowa had very little impact on stories about the Virgin of Guadalupe during the colonial period. It wasn't really, since it was published in Nahuatl, it wasn't easily read by many. And it doesn't become popular until the late 19th century when it's published again with a Spanish translation. Only then does it become the standard version. There was another book that I think was more influential, though a lot of historians overlook it. And that is a book written by a Jesuit named Mateo de la Cruz in 1660. And what de la Cruz did was take Miguel Sanchez's book and take the story of the apparition and copy that and edit it a little bit and get rid of all that theological argumentation. So it became much shorter and much more engaging to read. And that was really popular, and was reprinted many times. There are a couple of other important things about La Cruz's work. First of all, it was the first time that we ever hear dates associated with the apparitions. We know that December 12th is the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Mateo de la Cruz was the first to ever mention that, to put dates to it. And he's also the first to present a rivalry between the Virgin of Guadalupe and Our Lady of Remedies. Remember, Our Lady of Remedies was the most popular image around Mexico City at the time. And De la Cruz said, the Virgin of Guadalupe is the Creole image, and the Virgin of Remedies is the peninsular image. So if you're Creole, the message was, you should be a devotee of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And so there's rising popularity about the Virgin of Guadalupe. Like I said, in the 1670s, all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of sermons that get preached about the Virgin of Guadalupe and the apparition. There's just an explosion. There's other books written as well that are important, but I don't have time to go into. But still, the Virgin of Guadalupe hasn't eclipsed other important images. And that's not going to happen until 1737. Oh, I'm sorry, back up. We do know that she's getting popular because there's a new church built to her that's begun in 1695, finished in 1707. It's a big church. This is no simple shrine, but this is a significant church. But the Virgin of Guadalupe gets a big break in 1737. In 1737, a typhus epidemic strikes Mexico City. It's devastating. It's one of the most devastating epidemics to hit Mexico City in the colonial period. Over 20,000 people died from typhus. And people at the time resorted to what they normally did at that time. They resorted to images of saints. And they processed images of saints throughout the city, asking for their aid to intercede for them before God. And so the people of Mexico City went to their traditional saint for plagues, which was Our Lady of Loreto. But she didn't stop the plague. And so the people of Mexico City went to the most powerful image around, the Virgin of Remedies. But she didn't stop the plague. And so then on the third time, they decided, let's try the Virgin of Guadalupe. And lo and behold, the plague began to subside. And this is the Virgin of Guadalupe's big moment. It's from 1737 that she really begins to become popular. No, wrong minute. In 1737, the Archbishop of Mexico, Antonio de Guizaron, makes the Virgin of Guadalupe the patroness of Mexico City, replacing Our Lady of Remedies. He also proclaims her the patroness of all of New Spain, but he doesn't have that authority. He actually has to get that approved by the papacy. And that will eventually come. And it comes, well, it's approved by Benedict XIV in 1754, but that information doesn't arrive in Mexico City until 1756. When the Virgin of Guadalupe is proclaimed the patroness of all of New Spain, all of Mexico. And I just want to return to the theme of Creole patriotism. Because in the celebrations for the Virgin of Guadalupe being named patroness of Mexico, lots of sermons were preached. And many of them touched on this theme of Creole patriotism. I'm just going to read part of one. This one is by a preacher named Jose Rodriguez Vallejo y Diaz. And he says, quote, "The day has arrived, most felicitous America, in which insult has been transformed into praise. That which had been pale with insults has become an object of acclamation. What does it matter, O most pleasing and beloved motherland of mine? What to the works of so many authors who arc their fingers their quills as of arrows matter if you strengthen your shields of prudence, refuting their venomous points and not permitting them to diminish your glories. What does it matter that they scheme to suppress your son's noble works, calling them savage, ignorant, rude, and idolatrous? In the end, what does it matter if they vilify you repeatedly as blind, Gentile, barbarous, representing you as wretched and unfortunate, lacking in faith? We can say that canonized by the supreme head of the church today, you are recognized as faithful, fortunate, and blessed. Blessed are the children of America. Blessed are the Creoles. Not just because you, like Mary, knew to believe, but because you also knew to believe in the Virgin Mary. He's attacking the Peninsulars who had disparaged the Creoles. And he's saying, now we've been exonerated. We have the Virgin Guadalupe as our patron, as our patroness. Okay. So, after 1737, the devotion spreads fairly rapidly, particularly in central and northern Mexico. Lots of shrines are built to her, lots of churches are built to her, lots of copies of the image are made. Lots of other books and sermons are preached. But it's important to remember that she was promoted by the Creole clergy, and she was largely a Creole devotion at this time. There's very little evidence of indigenous devotion. I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to go over this last point, unfortunately, quickly, because on these first 2 points I've been relying on the work of other historians. This last one is really comes from my own research. I research the religious history of Mexico City, and from my own research, it's pretty clear that the Virgin of Guadalupe, even in Mexico City in the 18th century, was not a predominant devotion. Even after 1737, even after 1757, she was not. She was only one of many devotions that people resorted to in trying times. As Alex said, you can read my book. I look at last wills and testaments, and you may think that that's odd. Why would you look at last wills and testaments to examine religious culture? Well, it's because at that time, last wills and testaments were religious in nature. People opened them with a prayer. They designed their funerals in them. They left money to the church. They left gifts to images. They left gifts to religious causes and to charitable causes. And if you look at enough of these things over time, you can see patterns emerge. And so one of the things that people did in their wills was request or design their funerals. And a number of people actually requested burial next to an image. And so here you get the breakdown. I'm looking at the long 19th century here, so you can see the years that I'm looking at. This is based on a sample of almost 2,000 last wills and testaments. So about 65% of people who requested to be buried next to an image asked to be buried next to a Marian image. And about 17% asked to be buried next to an image of Christ. If we break down the Marian images, this is what we see. Guadalupe is pretty popular. Almost 16% of everyone who asked to be buried next to an image asked to be buried next to an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. She's popular, no question about it. Our Lady of Sorrows, though, is more popular. Notice, however, Our Lady of Remedies is popular in 1696, but not afterwards. Guadalupe has replaced her. People also gave gifts to images and to the Eucharist. Mostly this was wax in the form of candles or oil to be burned in lamps before the images. If it was a statue, it could be an earring, it could be a cloak, it could be a necklace, things of that sort, dresses. So people who gave gifts You know, almost 55% if they gave a gift to an image, it was to a Marian image, 26% to a Christocentric image, a crucifix or the baby Jesus or something of that sort. Again, if we break down the Marian images, we see that Guadalupe is pretty popular. 8% of all gifts to images were given to Guadalupe. Our Lady of Sorrows ties her, however. And there are a whole lot of others who are important. But again, look at Our Lady of Remedies. Very popular at the beginning of the 18th century, but declines after that. So what I want to point out here, and I'm sorry I have to go through this really quickly, is that even in Mexico City, the bastion of her devotion, of her cult, the Virgin of Guadalupe does not displace other devotions. She does not become the single devotion of the Mexican people. We historians, poor Virgin of Guadalupe, we're always trying to push her significance further and further future in time. And so this is my contribution to that. Sorry, Virgin of Guadalupe. But the question then becomes, how did the Virgin of Guadalupe become a symbol of the Mexican nation? Become a symbol of the indigenous population, of special aid to the indigenous population, because she wasn't before. There was some indigenous devotion, but it was mostly a Creole devotion. How did that happen? Well, that's a whole nother talk, and so you'll be glad to know that I'm not actually going to talk about that. But I want to point out that it's really a phenomenon of the 19th century, particularly of the late 19th century. And it begins with the Mexican independence movement. A Creole priest, Miguel Hidalgo, and this is a later image painted of him, there were no portraits of him painted at the time, was the father of the Mexican Revolution. He called for independence against Spain in 1810. At first he drew an army mostly of mestizos, people of mixed indigenous and Spanish heritage. That army was defeated. Later he raised an army mostly of indigenous people. That army was defeated. Miguel Hidalgo was captured and executed. But after Mexico achieved its independence from Spain in 1821, people looked back to Father Hidalgo. And Father Hidalgo took up the banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe to be the standard for his army, or for his armies. Many of the royalist armies fought under the standard of Our Lady of Remedies. During independence, there was a lot of confusion, or a lot of variation. Some rebels used Our Lady of Remedies. Some royalists used the Virgin of Guadalupe. In 19th century commemorations, however, of independence, Hidalgo is always associated with Guadalupe, and the royalists are always associated with Our Lady of Remedies. And Hidalgo's indigenous and mestizo armies are associated with Our Lady of Guadalupe. And after this is when Our Lady of Guadalupe becomes a symbol of the Mexican nation, becomes a symbol of aid to the indigenous population, and a symbol of liberation. So, in conclusion, Guadalupe achieved her preeminent place in Mexico's celestial hierarchy only as the colonial period came to a close, almost 300 years after the now accepted tradition claims. During most of those 300 years, Guadalupe was just one in many devotions in New Spain. Her devotions were localized around Mexico City, and she wasn't even the most popular one there. Only after 1737 did she begin to emerge as a regional or super-regional devotion. Even then, she was a Creole devotion, and only in the 19th century, after Mexico achieved its independence from Spain, did she become a truly national symbol who represented all Mexicans, one that united both Spanish and Indian populations in one devotion and one nation. The end. Thank you for your attention. Went a little bit longer than I hoped, so hopefully I can put you to sleep. Any questions?
That basilica that you said was built to Our Lady of Guadalupe, was that in Mexico City?
It's in Tepeyac, which in the colonial period was a separate pueblo. Today it is part of Mexico City because Mexico City is so huge now. It's 20 million people. But at the time it was just north of Mexico City by about 3 miles. And if you traveled from Veracruz, from the Gulf Coast to Mexico City, you pass through the Pueblo of Guadalupe, which was then later raised to the Villa of Guadalupe. It became a town. You had to pass through it in order to get to Mexico City. So it was just north of Mexico City. Just like where the Virgin of Remedies from Naucalpan is just west, or was just west of Mexico City, but now is part of the urban sprawl. And she was in the west. There were 2 other virgins, one in the east and one in the south as well. So Mexico City was defended by its 4 virgins. Yeah.
You use last wills and testaments.
Yep.
So I guess would you say there's an assumption that there's some, these Creoles had money in terms, of some kind of resources.
Yep.
Is there any way of getting at material like that would reflect the indigenous population, like ex-votos, or things that people that didn't have a lot of money?
Yep. So there are a couple of responses to that. First of all, there were indigenous people who wrote wills in Mexico City. And though they're a very small percentage, only 2% of the wills that I looked at were written by indigenous people. However, other historians have looked at last wills and testaments from indigenous towns around Mexico City. And they see an increase in references to the Virgin of Guadalupe at the very end of the 18th century, moving into the 19th century. The historian who's done the most work on this, his name is William Taylor, and what he's done is looked at baptismal names. And what he finds is that Creoles always outnumber indigenous populations in the use of Guadalupe as a baptismal name throughout the 19th century, but that the increase in indigenous populations' use of Guadalupe as a baptismal name does shoot up in the 19th century after independence. And so, these are imperfect markers, but, an indigenous population that had, did not write much, and what it wrote didn't survive if it did, this is the best that historians can do. Mm-hmm. But it's an excellent question. Of course, we'd all love to have, sources that we could go back and look at and have the definitive answer, but that's just not how.
Yeah, I was thinking about those ex-votos on tins, the tin paintings, but there's probably not a whole lot from them.
Those are also of the 19th century. You don't see them before the 19th century. There were ex-votos, but not the painted tins. There are the shapes, the metal shapes of
Milagros.
Yeah, the Milagros, but you can't date those. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, part of the story of Mexico is the mestizo, the intermarriage.
Yep.
How much, and how soon, and what is because part of that story of Guadalupe is mestizo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so it starts right away because the Spaniards who first came over were men. And they conquered a vulnerable indigenous population, and so mestizos, biological mestizos, began to be produced immediately. However, they weren't classified as mestizos until the 17th century. In most of the 16th century, mestizos were either classified as Spaniards or as indigenous, depending on who raised them. If they were raised largely by their Spanish fathers, they were generally considered Spaniards. If they were raised by their indigenous mothers, they were considered indigenous. And we start to see mestizos as a separate racial category appear at the very end of the 16th century, by the 1580s, but it really picks up by the beginning of the 17th century. Now, I did say, this is a process that begins right away. The biological mixing occurs right away. The classification of mestizos is something that comes later. However, it's in full force by the end of the colonial period. And as I said, Miguel Hidalgo's first army that he raised in the Bajío, just north of Mexico City, was largely mestizo. Only after that army was defeated and when he moved to Guadalajara in western Mexico did he raise a largely indigenous army. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but let me ask you: am I answering your question?
Well, how well accepted, or were there prejudices and classes of people?
Oh, yeah, the mestizos were denigrated. When we first see the classification of mestizos at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century, it's always as vagabonds. They're always associated with banditry, with low social position. Always. That shifts as the colonial period goes on, as the mestizo population continues to grow. Mexico doesn't identify itself as a mestizo nation until the early 20th century. Although there's a large mestizo population, that idea of a mestizo Mexico is something that's born slightly before the revolution, Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, but really picks up afterwards of that. And so the fact that we think of Mexico today as a mestizo nation, that's actually a relatively recent phenomenon, historically speaking. Okay.
Don't you think North American armies would benefit from having a little bit of this piety connected to their agendas? I mean, American military seems so crass and just harsh and mechanical. They don't have these beautiful, blessed saints that watch over them and pray for them.
I'm not sure how to respond to that.
I'm just thinking, just aesthetically, it'd be nicer to have a little bit of softness.
But perhaps. Now, the American military does have a very evangelical streak to it.
Yeah, they need an image. They need a strong image.
They probably wouldn't go for the version of Guadalupe, but wouldn't it be better if they did?
Well, remedies versus
exactly.
When did she become the patroness of the Americas?
Of the Americas. I should know that, but that was much later. That's a 20th century phenomenon, but I can't remember the date. Does somebody remember?
1890, actually.
1890?
The coronation.
That was 1895. The coronation was 1895. But was she proclaimed the patroness of all the Americas in 1895 as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So 1895. Okay.
Questions about you referred to the how literate the Nahuatl culture was, because I think, I'm a philosopher, so an available thesis is that there was a Nahuatl experience that was not produced by people who were used to producing such of a cult, etc., that gets appropriated by a Creole following in the 17th century that's starting its nationalistic thing. So part of the thing would be, when does the Creole identity really start developing? If that's 1555, 1556, there's a kind of if that's by mid-16th century. But the question is how possible would it have been for any kind of records from an Nahuatl experience to be preserved at all?
That's an excellent question, and I think there are at least two questions in there. First of all, Creole nationalism doesn't begin to emerge until the 17th century. Okay. So it's exactly at the time that Miguel Sanchez is reigning. So that's important to remember. The possibility of this being a Nahuatl story that's then appropriated, of course it's a possibility. Of course it's a possibility. There are a couple of things that I think militate against that. First of all is that Nahuatl literacy was actually fairly widespread.
And that's just top level.
It was the top level, but there were scribes in all of these indigenous communities who knew how to write Nahuatl using European script because the friars taught them, particularly the Franciscans, very early on, taught them to write Nahuatl phonetically using European script. And there is a surprising amount of documentation from the 16th century into the 17th century written in Nahuatl. It drops off after about 1750 when Spanish becomes more the lingua franca for even keeping documents in indigenous villages. But there's a surprising amount of it. In fact, lots of people have claimed, and this actually began with one of the prominent intellectuals of 17th century Mexico, Carlos Sigüenza y Góngora, who were trying to find documentation to push back the date of documentation about the apparition. And so they latched on to the Nicamapoa. And they claimed that it was written by one of the famous pupils of Friar Peter of Ghent, who was the first Franciscan to come to Mexico in 1523, who helped teach the Nahuatls to write European script. And his name was Antonio de Valero. And there was an attempt to claim Valero as the author of the Nicamapoa. But there are lots of problems with that, considering that the Nicamapoa has grammatical errors in it. It follows a European storyline, that it tracks Miguel Sanchez's story pretty well. And also, we know a lot of the other things that, that he wrote, and he never claims to have written anything about this. And so it has the feel of somebody grasping to try to find authentic Nahuatl authorship of this. The things that suggest that it probably wasn't a Nahuatl story that was appropriated was simply the fact that it follows a traditional European apparition tale outline. Could it possibly have been a Nahuatl story? Yeah, it could have been. It's possible. Chimaparin, has that reference. She revealed herself in 1556. It's tantalizing, but that's all he says. And so it's hard to know. It is possible. It is possible that both Miguel Sanchez and Luis Lasso de la Vega were looking at the same source and wrote differently, but that source has never shown up, and both of them claim that they have never heard, Luis Lasso de la Vega in the approbation for Miguel Sanchez's work claims that he never heard of it before, of the story, and Miguel Sanchez says there were no records of it. He got the story by interviewing people. It's do we believe him or not? And some people believe him, and some people don't. But that's always a possibility. Other questions? Yeah.
Yes, one question. Are there any recent investigations about the archaeology of the Tepeyac area? Because I know that recently it was rebuilt, the Iglesia de Indios, el Templo de Indios, one of the original churches before the construction of the Basilica in the 18th century. And I know that they found the original church, small church, ermita, and they have been making some excavation, archaeological investigation. But is this published? Are there some published documents that talk about this? Investigations?
I have to admit that I don't know. Being an historian, I'm not familiar with the archaeological excavations, so I have to plead ignorance on that account. so I apologize. But now I'm fascinated, so I will go look.
Yes.
And I will answer your question in a couple of weeks. So send me an email. I'll be glad to answer, because I didn't know that, so yeah, I'll definitely look into it. Any other questions?
When you say the European apparition storyline, could you expand a little bit on what that is?
So there are lots of accounts of Mary appearing and speaking to people and asking them to build shrines from the late medieval period into the early modern period. And so they always follow the same storyline. Mary appears, whoever she appears to then tries to go to somebody in power to get a shrine built, and the person says, "Oh, I don't believe you." And then the person always, there's a second apparition, and Mary says, you know, go do this, and the person always tries to beg off. "Oh, I'm not, you know, intelligent enough to do this. Pick somebody else." And then there's a third time that she appears, and lo and behold, something happens that allows the shrine to be built. And so it follows that basic storyline.
Is she as popular in Guatemala? And you've spent a lot of time in Guatemala. And I don't remember from when I was there.
She's popular in all the Americas. Guatemalans have a particular disaffection for Mexico. So anything Mexican is generally looked at a bit askance. So yeah, of course it's popular in Guatemala, but you know, Guatemala has its local images. The Cristo de Esquipulas is certainly more popular than the Virgin of Guadalupe.
Okay, well, thank you. If you want to talk with Brian a little bit more, we'll let the students go. The reading circle just maybe in the room nearby. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much.
Could you give us the title of your book?
It's called The Very Nature of God, Baroque Catholicism and Religious Reform in Urban Mexico City. And now I'm researching Eucharistic piety in the Archdiocese of Mexico.